Hello everyone, Game Professor here for a new thing we're doing on the channel. I'm going to just do some monthly Q&A videos, just some casual answering some questions that you guys have about, current events in video games, my opinion on certain random video games, or whatever random things any of you might want to ask me. Specifically, there's a specific tier on my Patreon that enables people to put in one question a month that I will answer on these monthly Q&A videos. So if that's something you're interested in, check out Patreon, and for now, let's get started. First question for this one is from Sebastian. He says, "Hey there, just wondering what your sophisticated opinion on the wave of remastered and remade games is. In my opinion, it's quite nice for newer gamers to get to know the classic titles in a decent shape, but somehow I feel like the easy money grab is hindering further development of new and interesting ideas." Well, I don't know how sophisticated this opinion is necessarily, but I get where you're coming from, for sure. Artistic industries profit a lot from nostalgia, so it's hard to see much in the way of any sort of corporate motivation in these remakes and remasters aside from making money. That said, I do think there's some value in them that kind of outweighs that cynicism to me. Specifically, that's game preservation. If we take an example like Shadow of the Colossus, if it only existed on the PlayStation 2, it would be very difficult to play now. Most PlayStation 3 models aren't backwards compatible, neither is the PlayStation 4, so playing Shadow of the Colossus would, at this point, without the PS3 and PS4 remakes, require an old model of a PS3 or an original PS2, along with the game itself, which would, over time, without the remakes, just increase exponentially in cost. Any way to legitimately and legally play the game would become prohibitively expensive, and I think that would be pretty awful. Having remakes like this make it so that if someone wants to play Shadow of the Colossus for the first time, they just need to pick up a PS4 copy, and I think that is an incredible benefit. And there are a lot of games that have had these remakes and remasters in such a way that isn't just a money grab, even if that is probably the reason they were made, but allow these games to continue to be played by newer generations when they might just never have been otherwise. So yeah, I'm sure that the motivation is just money grabbing, and I totally get being cynical about that, but honestly, I don't think it's a bad thing. I think that the benefits outweigh the cost on this one. Second question's from Georgia, who asks, "I'd be really interested to know if there are any up-and-coming game technologies that you'd really want to see specifically utilized for storytelling, such as VR, augmented reality, or even older fads that were never utilized to their fullest potential." Considering it was mentioned in the question, it might be kind of an easy answer, but VR, for sure, is something I'm really interested in. I've got a Vive from back when I had the money to buy things like that, and I think it's a really interesting piece of technology that has... immersion has become something of a meaningless buzzword in video games at this point, but the ability to stand in a place and feel like you're there is something that has the potential to really make for emotional and impacting experiences. I'd like to see that used not just for video game storytelling, but for documentaries, for instance, things like that. I think that it could make for some really interesting and impactful stuff in the future. It's just going to need to become a lot more affordable and accessible for that to really become a regular thing. I really hope that fly wasn't visible. He just 3 times. Next question is from Ungentleman, who asks, "The anime viewer Arcada often says the ending is paramount in his reviews, often talking about how a bad ending can sink an entire show. Games are no strangers to bad or disappointing endings, be it Zen from Half-Life or the final 15 minutes of Mass Effect 3. How important do you think endings are for games, especially given how most gamers don't finish their games? One industry study put the completion rate for a game as low as 30%. Now, the low completion rate of games is an important conversation to have, but it's kind of unrelated to this, in my opinion, and it's a big, long thing to get into, so we'll put that to the side for now. I don't think that a bad ending completely invalidates everything that a work has going for it. The ending is pretty important nonetheless, essentially for 2 reasons. One, that it is the thing that gives the final impression. It brings closure to everything and brings it all together, and if it fails to do that, well, it is going to affect how we feel about it all when we're done with it. Like that, just in terms of our own visceral feelings and reactions to it, it will have a big effect. But aside from that, it's also very important thematically. If you have a story that just doesn't have an ending, then effectively you have one that doesn't resolve any of its themes or messages that it's talking about. And if the ending is really bad and fails to do that resolution, then it could really jeopardize the entire thing that the story is trying to say or that it's trying to explore. So yeah, that can be a really big problem for a game's meaning. So yeah, I don't think that a bad ending invalidates the quality of a game if it is an otherwise good game, but I do think that it causes a lot of problems on a narrative level and affects our emotions about the game pretty strongly. Next question is from Aqua Painter, who asks, what's one game you feel like deserves more attention for its story or its mechanics as metaphor than it gets? Now, there are a lot of these. It's kind of a hard question to answer, but most of the ones I come up with aren't so much perfect, amazing hidden gems that no one's played, but games that have a lot of problems but have some interesting things going for them. So for the sake of having one game to talk about in this answer, I'm going to say the 2008 Prince of Persia. Don't get me wrong, this is not a great game. It's arguably not even particularly just good on a basic level, but it had a few interesting things going for it that mostly got messed up by other things it was trying to do. Mostly that it had an open world sort of structure where you had a few different areas that each were dedicated to a specific sort of character arc in the developing relationship of the two main characters, but you would go a little bit through one and then have to go to another one in order to get further in this one. So you'd get a little bit into this issue in their relationship and then move on to something completely different that has them in a completely different dynamic, and then go back to that one and have them just back on whatever they were having trouble with before, and it super did not work out. Mostly, though, I was impressed with how it occasionally did some neat mechanical things. Like, there's a mechanic in the game where if you fall, then you're brought, back up to everything by Elika, I believe was her name in this one. She would magically appear down there and bring you back up. And there's a boss fight or something where she's taken from you, and the only way to actually succeed and move forward is to jump, knowing that she will catch you and you'll be reunited. Like, to make use of that mechanic as part of the story and a reason to bring her back. And that was kind of neat and interesting. I was into that. And also, without trying to spoil too much, it does that thing that I'm a real sucker for, where right at the end of the game, you have to do something that you as the player know is probably the wrong decision, but that the character would do and does do, and you have to take them through that, even though you probably don't think it's a good idea. Like I said, I'm a sucker for that. That always gets me, so props to it for that. Again, not a particularly good game, but it had a few interesting ideas, and I'm glad I played it, if only for that. And the last question for this video is from Lunin, who asks, when a game narrative includes a well-executed bittersweet ending as the standard way to play the game, do you feel that the addition of a good or golden ending later through DLC or an update helps or hurts the overall experience? This is a very specific question. This is something that I can only think of happening in a few instances, and the answer is it kind of depends. Most of this, in my mind, comes down to canon and the importance of these endings to it. The Fatal Frame games, for instance, had extra endings that were added into the Xbox versions after the original PS2 versions came out, and that I don't particularly mind, because there's a particular ending to those games that's canon and factors into future games, and they're included in the original. The extra endings are either weird or just kind of really nice and end happier, but don't actually factor into things later, so they don't affect one's ability to understand where this story's going. That's fine by me. Similarly, the added content in Persona 4 Golden, as an example, is something that I'm also fine with on account of it being sort of a later re-release. You're not withholding important information. Persona 4 was still a complete game on the PS2, even if they added more stuff later on. That's fine by me. What I have a problem with is in games like Alan Wake, as an example, or the significantly less good game Castlevania Lords of Shadow, where the ending is confusing and weird, and then they add very important stuff, sort of expanding it into any kind of sense in downloadable content that you have to buy separately, because at that point it doesn't feel like the original game you got is a complete story. The main thing for me is that I want the game to be complete. So yeah, added stuff later is fine by me. It's just that if it's going to change fundamentally the original experience in such a way that makes it a necessity for understanding the game, then yeah, that's where I start to take issue. And those are all the questions for this time. Like I said, there is a certain level of Patreon support at which you can ask me these questions on a monthly basis, and I'll continue making these Q&A videos. So if that's something you're interested in, head on to patreon.com/gamesaslit. There's a link in the description, and I'll put one, I always forget which corner it is, one of these corners. And you can check that out if that's something you're interested in. And if you have any questions that you'd like me to answer, then you can ask them. So yeah, it's good seeing you all. I have more videos coming out, I promise, so I will talk to you then. Later.